He was written as a deep-dyed, snarling villain, and he bored the out of me, because there is no longevity in deep-dyed, snarling villainy. And already I started to plan what I was going to do about that. Irwin not only allowed me to do that, but one day said, "Do more." And I did. And the rest, as we say, is history.
A 99-year-old woman sat in her home in Santa Monica reading the newspaper every single morning, right up until the week she passed. She had been part of one of the most famous families in American television, a family that never actually made it home. And by the time she was gone, almost everyone who built that spaceship with her was gone too. What's left is a story most fans never got the full picture of, not because it was hidden on purpose, but because nobody ever put all the pieces next to each other at once. So let's do that now. Lost in Space premiered on CBS on September 15, 1965, and for 3 seasons it followed the Robinson family after their mission to colonize a planet near Alpha Centauri goes wrong. Most people who grew up with the show remember the robot, the villain, and the campy Planet of the Week plots. Fewer people know what it took to build that show, what it cost the people inside it, and how differently it could have turned out. Start with the pilot nobody saw for almost 30 years. Before there was a Dr. Smith or a robot, producer Irwin Allen shot a serious, straightforward science fiction pilot called No Place to Hide. It followed the Robinson family and a scientist named Don West on a spacecraft called the Gemini 12, knocked off course by a meteor storm. There was no saboteur. There was no comic relief. It was survival drama, filmed with real ambition, a budget north of $600,000, which made it the most expensive television pilot of its era. CBS liked it enough to buy the series, but they wanted more conflict than a family quietly surviving on an alien world could deliver week after week. So the network asked for a recurring antagonist, and the writers eventually landed on Dr. Zachary Smith. A robot was added too. The ship was redesigned and renamed the Jupiter 2. Much of that original pilot footage didn't go to waste. Large chunks of it were edited into the first several episodes of Season 1, with new scenes built around it to explain why Smith and the robot weren't there yet. Most viewers at the time had no idea they were watching footage shot for an entirely different, more serious show. That single decision, adding Dr. Smith, changed the entire trajectory of the series, and it happened almost by accident. Jonathan Harris, the actor cast as Smith, came from a very different background than the villain he was hired to play. Born in the Bronx to a family of Russian immigrants, he changed his birth name as a young man and built a career for himself in theater, appearing in dozens of stage productions before television ever called. When Irwin Allen offered him the role of Dr. Smith, the character on the page was a cold, dangerous saboteur written to be eliminated within the first handful of episodes. Harris reportedly understood right away that playing a character who dies early doesn't build a career, so according to accounts from people who worked with him, he began pushing to make Smith stranger, funnier, and more central. The cowardice, the elaborate insults directed at the robot, the theatrical complaining. None of that was in the original scripts. It became so central to the show's identity that Harris negotiated a special guest star credit on every episode he appeared in for all 3 seasons, an unusual arrangement for network television at the time. Whether you call that clever self-preservation or quietly rewriting the show around himself, it worked. Dr. Smith became the character fans wrote in about the most. That popularity came at a cost to someone else. Guy Williams, who played family patriarch John Robinson, had already built a career as a leading man through his years on Disney's Zorro. He came into Lost in Space expecting to be the center of the show. Instead, as Dr. Smith's storylines expanded season after season, Williams found his screen time shrinking. By the 3rd season, longtime co-star Mark Goddard, who played pilot Don West, later described real tension on set, with Williams increasingly sidelined in his own show. It's a pattern anyone who's worked on a long-running series will recognize. A character breaks out, the writers chase what's working, and the person who was supposed to be the lead ends up standing in the background. What happened to Williams afterward is one of the stranger footnotes in television history. His career in Hollywood never fully recovered after the show ended, but in Argentina, where reruns of Zorro had made him enormously popular, he became something close to a celebrity for the rest of his life. He spent his final 2 decades living largely in Buenos Aires. In 1989, after friends hadn't heard from him for some time, police found him alone in his apartment. He had died of a ruptured brain aneurysm roughly a week earlier. He was 65. It's a quietly sad ending for a man who was supposed to be the face of the franchise, and it's rarely mentioned in the same breath as the show's more famous trivia. Then there's the person who never got a screen credit at all despite being in nearly every episode. Bob May, the man inside the robot suit. May had no background as a performer when Irwin Allen's team recruited him. He'd wandered into a casting call at 20th Century Fox for an entirely different job. The audition for the robot suit, as later recounted, was simple. If your body fit inside it, you got the part. The suit itself was heavy, poorly ventilated, and difficult to move in under hot studio lights, and May reportedly lost consciousness inside it more than once during filming. Despite performing every physical movement that made the robot beloved by millions of children, May was never given an on-screen credit during the show's original run, which affected his pay and residuals for decades afterward. He spent his later years as one of the most well-liked figures on the science fiction convention circuit, known for staying at autograph tables until every fan in line had been taken care of. He passed away in 2009, not long after a wildfire destroyed his home in the San Fernando Valley. It's a rough footnote for someone who spent 3 years literally inside the show's most iconic character. The rivalry between Lost in Space and Star Trek is another piece of the story that's often misunderstood. People assume the two shows were locked in an even fight for the same audience, but in the ratings, it wasn't close. Lost in Space consistently outperformed Star Trek during their overlapping seasons, even though Star Trek is the one remembered today as the more influential and celebrated series. Both shows also had a strange origin connection. CBS considered and passed on Star Trek partly because they were already developing Lost in Space and didn't want 2 competing space shows on their air. Gene Roddenberry took Star Trek to NBC instead. The 2 productions crossed paths again in a small, funny way during Lost in Space's 3rd season, when the makeup department needed pointed ears for an alien character and, pressed for time and budget, borrowed the actual ear molds used for Spock from the Star Trek production. Fans who noticed the resemblance accused the show of copying, but the real explanation was much less dramatic. Makeup artists on competing shows often knew each other and shared resources when deadlines were tight. Inside the Robinson family itself, 2 of the child actors experienced something that outlasted the show by more than 50 years. Bill Mumy, who played Will Robinson, and Angela Cartwright, who played his TV sister Penny, grew up together on that set through their entire adolescence, studying together in the studio school and spending nearly all their working hours side by side. They dated as young adults and were reportedly engaged for a period in the early 1970s before deciding, mutually and without resentment, to go their separate ways romantically. What makes the story worth telling isn't the breakup, it's what came after. The 2 remained close friends for the rest of their lives, co-authoring books together and continuing to appear at conventions side by side well into their 70s. As recently as last year, Mumy shared a photo of himself with Cartwright and their co-star Marta Kristen, decades after the show ended, still finding reasons to get together. Mumy also had a quieter, more amusing secret. While playing a character in direct competition with Star Trek during the day, he was reportedly a genuine fan of that very show in his off hours. He eventually got to close the loop on that decades later, taking a guest role on Star Trek Deep Space Nine as a Starfleet officer whose character dies during the episode, a small, knowing wink at the actor who grew up playing the rival franchise's most famous kid. The show's Cancellation is its own case study in how television treated its people in that era. Lost in Space ran for 83 episodes across 3 seasons and never got a proper finale. The Robinsons were never rescued. They never reached Alpha Centauri. The final episode filmed ended with the family still stranded, with cast and crew believing a 4th season was already in motion. It wasn't. CBS offered to renew the show only if the production accepted a significant budget cut, and Irwin Allen refused the terms. The cancellation was announced in February 1968, reportedly catching several cast members off guard. Accounts describe June Lockhart learning about it from a small item in the newspaper rather than a call from the studio, and young Bill Mumy, only a teenager at the time, being deeply upset by the news. There was no wrap party and no formal send-off for a show that had been one of the most watched science fiction programs on American television. If you want a symbol for how far the show had drifted from its serious origins by the end, look no further than The Great Vegetable Rebellion, an episode from the final season in which Dr. Smith is put on trial by a sentient plant and turned into a stalk of celery, opposite a villain played by an actor in a full carrot costume. Cast members have said they struggled to keep straight faces filming it. It's remembered today, somewhat affectionately, as one of the campiest hours of 1960s television, and yet, strangely, when TV Guide ranked the 100 greatest television episodes of all time in 1997, that carrot episode placed higher on the list than The City on the Edge of Forever, the Star Trek episode widely considered one of the best hours of science fiction ever produced. Television doesn't always reward what critics think it should. The years that followed sent the cast in very different directions. Mark Goddard eventually left acting to become a special education teacher in Massachusetts, spending decades working directly with children rather than chasing more roles. Jonathan Harris built a long second career as a voice actor, including memorable work in Pixar's A Bug's Life and in Toy Story 2, using the comic timing he'd perfected as Dr. Smith in an entirely new medium. When a Lost in Space feature film was made in the late 1990s, Harris was reportedly offered only a brief cameo appearance, which he turned down. He'd never played a minor role in his career and wasn't interested in starting at that stage of his life. He passed away in 2002, just days short of his 88th birthday, reportedly while a planned reunion project he was attached to was still in early development. The franchise did eventually find a way to honor its original cast without needing them to physically return. Netflix's 2018 reboot wove in quiet tributes. The rebooted Dr. Smith's name combined elements of both June Lockhart's and Jonathan Harris's original characters. Bill Mumy appeared in a small role in the pilot, Angela Cartwright played a supporting character in the second season, and June Lockhart herself, then in her 90s, voiced a character in the third season. A small final connection between the actress and the franchise that first made her famous in space. June Lockhart lived long enough to see the show cancelled, criticized, revived, mocked, and eventually celebrated by new generations of fans discovering it decades later. She passed away peacefully at her home in October 2025, at the age of 100, having outlived nearly everyone else who built that spaceship with her. What outlasted the show's rocky ending, the uncredited labor, and the industry's short memory for the people who make television work, was something much simpler. The friendships that formed inside the Jupiter 2 kept going long after the cameras stopped rolling. The Robinson family never found their way home in the story. The people who played them kept finding their way back to each other for the rest of their lives. If any of this surprised you, or if it brought back a memory of watching this show growing up, let us know in the comments. And if you'd like more deep dives like this into the real stories behind classic television, consider subscribing for more.